You're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Grant Hardy. Jessica Slice is a disabled author, speaker, and essayist. Her book, Unfit Parent, A Disabled Mother Challenges an Inaccessible World, debunks the exclusionary myths that deem disabled people, quote, unfit to care for their children, and instead shows how disabled parents and disability culture provide valuable lessons for rejecting societal rules that encourage perfectionism and lead to isolation. Jessica is joining us on the Pulse here to talk about her book and some perspective on parenting with a disability. Jessica, it's great to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Maybe, if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself and why you were inspired to write this book, Unfit Parent.
I am a disabled mom, and in 2019, I tried writing for the first time. And the first piece I wrote was about this sense I have as a parent that I'm not a real mom. And that when I'm around other non disabled moms, I felt like they were all real moms and I was like pretending to be one of them. And it's a pretty vulnerable piece, and I guess it's pretty obvious that a lot of that comes from internalized ableism. But when I
Mhm.
wrote that, it was published in the Washington Post, and I heard from hundreds of disabled parents, and they were like, "Oh, thank you for talking about this, or for talking about disabled parenting, because there are, 6 to 10% of parents are disabled, but we're almost
Mhm.
entirely absent from media." And so just the visibility of it seemed to be meaningful, and I kept writing about it, and eventually that led to a discussion with a publisher about a book, and it's the topic I think the most about because, my kids are young, and so the 2 biggest things that take up most of every day for me is my disability and then my children, and then the intersection of the 2.
Anecdotally, just from my experience, the influencers or the writers, the people I know who have disabilities and have kids, their children grow up to be the most compassionate, like intelligent, well-adjusted people that I've ever known, which is so interesting. What do you think about that? Do you kind of feel the same when you look at the community? Like I really wonder whether actually
Mhm.
having one or two disabled parents is actually a benefit for kids.
I mean, yes, anecdotally, I think that's true. I think that it's very natural for a child to be self-focused, and I think in many
Mhm.
ways that's good. I think it's good for a child to be concerned about themselves. It's or developmentally natural at least. But I think having something pushing against that, like a constant reminder that there are other experiences that are valid and real, I think that's beneficial. I don't know, my 8-year-old, yeah, I have an 8-year-old and a 1-year-old, and my
Mhm.
8-year-old is obviously just a kid who, wants, like, more
Yeah.
toys or more TV or food when she wants it, but also she is always clocking me and my needs, and I could see an argument, like, maybe this is, like, early parentification, or maybe she's, taking on too much, but she's not taking on that much. It's just this kind of, like, it just offsets things a little bit. Even yesterday, she and I were joking about if she would be able to climb up this wall near our house onto a roof. I mean, I'm not an amateur. I wasn't telling her to climb a wall, but
Mm.
we were just saying like, "Okay, if you were a video game character, how would you get up this wall?" And then I pretended for a moment like I was going to climb the wall, which obviously I wouldn't. I'm a wheelchair user and could
Mhm.
never climb a wall. And she, before even a second passed, she said, "Mama, stop! You have a disability. Don't hurt yourself." And I just like, I don't know. I was so tickled by her yelling, "You have a disability" at me.
Yeah, that's maybe not the first thing you would expect to come out of a 8-year-old's mouth, maybe in that context especially.
Yeah.
Um, but that's really funny, and I definitely did not mean any sort of pressure with that question. I just think it's
Yeah.
interesting. It's sort of like exposing kids to as many different perspectives and diversity as possible. Just wanted to chat a little bit more about your goals for the book. Like, who do you hope is going to read it? Maybe some non-disabled folk as well. What sort of advocacy are you hoping to have impression to
Mhm.
make with your book?
My initial, audience, the one I had in mind is other disabled parents. I wanted a place where people could feel seen and feel like their inner and outer experience was at least in part represented. It's obviously impossible to write a book that will feel true to every person, but I wanted something to feel familiar for disabled parents. Um, but I also, I thought about other people in writing it too. I thought about medical professionals and social
Mm,
workers and those who have the power to impact disabled lives so significantly. Like something I encountered in the book is almost everyone I interviewed had at least one interaction with the Child Protective Services, had someone call and question their capacity to parent. And so if I could write a book outlining the creativity and the ingenuity and the capacity of disabled parents, and that could serve as, a counter to this argument that disabled
mm,
parents are unfit, then I wanted to do that. So I did also imagine, like, could this be read at a social work school or in a medical school to advocate for our rights and our capacities? Um, and then I also ended up, which I didn't know going into, but writing a book that I think would impact non-disabled parents because I write about how the system of intensive, individualistic,
mm,
this like perfectionistic parenting that kind of governs most of society rejects disabled people like completely. And
mhm.
so disabled people then have to reject that system right back and create something new. And I think the sense of creativity and community and slowness and acceptance that disabled people are able to create, I think that offers a way out for non-disabled too. Not that they yeah, that it's like, "Here, this is a different way to be if you're interested."
Yeah, we seem to be shifting away from a more community based approach and
Mm.
into a very isolation, individual based approach. How can we find our community again?
I mean, I'd love to hear what you think. I feel like as disabled people, we are pretty good at community because we have to express our needs so often, and I feel like expressing needs leads to other people expressing needs, which leads to community and kind of a shared burden of them. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I suppose, is partially just finding some common ground that always kind
Mhm.
of helps break the ice a little bit. And yeah,
Mm.
I mean, I think that perhaps we are a little less shy to like ask for help, but also offer help too, maybe
Mhm.
exchange help, build on each other's skills, and definitely to keep up with our networking and that sort of thing. So I suppose part of that is, yeah, just being part of a marginalized group can be really
Right.
helpful for community.
It really can. I think about this disabled reporter came to interview me after the book came out.
Mhm.
She works at NPR, and she came to my house. And before the
Mm,
meeting, she said, "What accommodations would make it so the interview is less taxing on your body?" And I said, "Well, I'll need to be lying down or reclined. Will
mhm,
that work?" And she said, "Yeah, that works great with the mic." And then she said, I know it's at that point, it was still kind of respiratory season. She said, "Would you like me to mask inside to reduce virus risk?" And I said, "Oh,
mhm,
that would be wonderful. Would you like me to mask?" And she said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And I
mm.
said, "What seating would be best for you with your disability?" And I don't know, I really like this, the sense that we weren't embarrassed to be 2 people who had needs. We still had a job to do and we wanted to do it, but we weren't ignoring that we live in bodies, and I think that could be good for every person, not just disabled people.
Yeah, it's a cool way of framing it. Sometimes I've been guilty of being asked, what accommodations do you need by someone who isn't disabled? And I kind of like, if I needed something, I would
Mhm.
point it out. But it's really more just reframing, like, let's just all ask for what we'd be most comfortable with. And, if it's
Yeah.
reasonable, like there's no way we have to be so rigid, right? Let's just
Right.
help each other out. So the other thing I wanted to touch on, and you mentioned this earlier, is the medical system. I'm not a parent, but
Mhm.
definitely reading some bloggers, some people I know with disabilities, the stories of being harassed in public, threatened, or have people going through with calling CPS are really just heart wrenching. So I
Mhm.
suppose I'm just curious. I guess, first of all, do you have advice for parents on handling that harassment in public in a way that is most likely to either get them out of the situation, make it a teachable moment, but also maintain a positive environment for their kid? I know it's a
I mean,
lot of pressure, but
yeah, I think there's 2 different types of harassment. There's one,
mm,
people in public who just have opinions,
mm,
and I think you get to handle them however will protect your kids and get you
mm,
out of a situation. There's one mom I interviewed, and people like, this one woman drove along beside her shouting out her car window that it wasn't safe to have her son on the wheelchair, and she
mm,
just ignored her and kept on going, and that's obviously what you should do in that situation. Um, when Child Protective Services is called, then it's best to get in an advocacy organization, and there are attorneys who specialize in disabled parents and child removal, and often they work as consultants so that they can be advising on many cases at a time and not just, have to devote all their time to the case that they're the full-time attorney for. Um, but at Brandeis in the US, there's this disabled parenting project, and in California, I'm blanking on the name of the organization, but if you Google it, there's an organization
yeah,
that
for
has
sure.
attorneys on staff. And I mean, I think as soon as CPS is involved, you need legal help. When people ask questions, when it's not as much harassment, like screaming at me with the window down,
Mm,
I try to answer in front of my kids in a way that shows I'm not embarrassed, even if I do feel embarrassed, but I want to demonstrate that it is okay to have a body like mine and a life like ours, and I wanna perform that for my kids. Um, I don't know, once in an airport, a person told me I wasn't allowed to have my child on my lap, and that was obviously very challenging. I guess in that it's a case by case basis, and you just have to try to, like, navigate.
Yeah, I remember reading a story about a partially sighted person who was advised and successfully resisted and gained a lot of public support. But there was an argument about whether his baby should go and sit with some other passenger on the airplane, which is totally ridiculous.
Mhm.
Baby would
Mhm.
have been very upset. Who
Mhm.
knows what kind of
Yeah.
care that would have received.
Mhm.
But uh, he was able to file a complaint as well, and in the moment, reverse prevent that actual
Mhm. Mhm.
discrimination from going into effect. But I'm just curious. I don't know. Do you find most of the public is supportive, or is it kind of 50-50? I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but I guess, are most people supportive and it's just that odd few, or is it kind of a wash?
Uh I mean, it's worth pointing out that I'm white and I present as at least middle class,
Mm,
or, depends on how put together I am, maybe more than middle class.
mm,
And I'm thin and my kids
mm,
are generally well dressed, so I think people are generally supportive
mm.
to me because my presentation is a privilege
Yeah,
that
that's fair.
we aren't messy, which I think would bring more judgment.
Mm,
Yeah, so I think there's that, and so it's easy for me to say, "Yeah, in general, people are supportive." I have encountered ignorant comments, but I don't go out bracing myself. I live in Toronto, a big city, and when I'm out with both of my kids, many people say hi to us, and I think it's often because they're kind of gawking at the sight of the baby on my lap and my 8-year-old with her hand tucked on, on the armrest of my wheelchair, and
Mhm.
we're kind of taking up a lot of space on the sidewalk, and I think when someone, like, stares at you for a while, then they feel like they have to say hi, and so
Aw.
she y and so it's like we're kind of a spectacle, but
Mhm.
then people are nice about it, but I could easily see it going the other way if our presentation was different.
That's fair. And in Canada, with the actual medical system, once somebody gets, you know, whatever it is, CPS involved, that is really something you do not deal with on your own. Like, what is it like navigating based on what you've heard? Is the system kind of stacked against you a little bit?
Definitely, and I'm more familiar with the rules in the US. I'm from the
Hmm.
US.
Hmm.
I went to social work school in the US, and that's where most of the research for the book about the Child Protective Services was. But at least in the US and over half the country, disability is a reason a child can be removed from their parents, even before actual neglect or abuse is shown, that you can just list disability. And the judge or the social worker has to expect that the disability will lead to neglect or abuse. But the major problem with that is most like law schools and social work programs are not remotely accessible. And so very few disabled people end up in those roles. And so if there's a bunch of non-disabled people making judgments about the capacity of a disabled person, then their view is obviously skewed. And so I think, like, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I
Hmm.
think a lot of these CPS cases come down to accessibility in higher education, because if you were to imagine a bunch of disabled doctors, a bunch of disabled judges, a bunch of disabled social workers, a bunch of disabled nurses, then when a disabled person enters their world, we would be met with understanding and acceptance and openness instead of being seen as other or inferior or, insufficient.
For sure. Yeah. People sort of think, if I suddenly had the same disability
Ugh,
today, would I be able to provide an equal amount of care as someone who had it for their whole life, which they may not be at that point. But it certainly.
exactly. Yes. Oh my gosh, that's exactly it. Because as you know, with the disability, you develop, like, all of these creative and intricate skills over time. It's not the same as if I became, like, low vision tomorrow and
Mhm.
had to navigate my house. It's not the same as if you did that tomorrow.
Exactly. Speaking of problem solving, you do talk about that in your book and just how people with disabilities do become excellent problem solvers, excellent navigators at impossible or difficult systems like the ones that we've just described. How does that influence one's ability to be a parent?
I think the skill set translates directly between what it takes to navigate a world in a day as a disabled person to navigate a world in a day as a parent. Um, I'm trying to think, like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but as I don't know how it is for you to feed yourself, but for me, with my disability and with my energy limitations, and then with like digestive limitations, I am kind of constantly figuring out how to get nutritious, or at least like a little bit nutritious food into my body.
Mhm.
And there is no one more reluctant to eat nutritious food than, like, many children, including my own. And I feel like just kind of like creativity and openness with food and a sense of, or a capacity to problem solve has translated directly from feeding my own disabled body to feeding children.
Right, and it makes sense. Absolutely, that perspective, that different perspective, that planning, that problem
Mhm.
solving. One thing you talk about in your book is you've spoken to many disabled and able-bodied parents, and that you found that they had very different perspectives. I'm just curious if you can maybe touch on that a bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of what it comes down to is that, and this is particularly in early parenthood when you're adjusting to becoming a parent for the first time, that I think parenting is an automatic relationship with disability, or at least with fragility and like unpredictableness and unpredictability of bodies. And so, say you're a person who gave birth and you return from the hospital, you're probably in like tremendous pain. You need to ask for a lot of help. You may be having complications with your healing. And then you're also taking care of a newborn who, like, newborns breathe so
Mhm.
erratically, they eat erratically, they poop erratically, they drink it, like everything is erratic. And if you are not experienced with disability, all of these things feel terrifying because you feel like you're suddenly proximate to the fragility of being a human. And we're taught our whole lives to be terrified of disability and be terrified of weakness. But if you are disabled, like which I was when I became a
Mhm.
parent, this proximity to need and this sense that bodies don't always make sense. It was like, yeah, I had been living there for a
Mm.
long time. That wasn't new to me. And so the practical parts of the day were the same as if I hadn't been disabled. Well, they were probably different because I'm disabled, but the practical parts of the baby's needs were the same. But I wasn't scared of a day or a body that worked that way. And when I interviewed people for the book, I found this was true in actually a few dozen interviews. I found it was true in all but one case, that the disabled parents adjusted to parenthood much easier than the non-disabled parents.
It's interesting. There's so much statistics about how many people will have a disability, at certain points in their life. But really, if you think about it from that different perspective of, babies being very physically, um, dare I say, disabled,
I
you're
think
looking at
so.
yeah, you're looking at a society where essentially 100% of people will use disability. AIDS
Mhm.
will have that experience of disability. So your book really touches on the irony of the sphere of disability when it's literally all around us. For example, why would you put a baby in a stroller to help them walk, but you wouldn't think to use a wheelchair when you're in significant pain after labor and have to get to the hospital? Why is this so
Yeah.
ironic to you, and how can we change that stigma or that fear around disability?
I mean, I think there's a such a false, uh, belief that life is much worse if you're disabled. I think some people who are disabled don't like their lives, and some people who are not disabled don't like their lives,
Mhm.
but statistically, there's not a direct correlation between disability and dissatisfaction. And I also think because we live in such a hyper capitalistic society, there's a sense that if you're not very productive, your life is worse, which in many
Mhm.
ways is true because you're kept out of, many like economic privileges. Um, but I think we are raised in an environment that we think our satisfaction is linked, or a good life is linked to our own strength and what we are powerful enough to do on our own. And I think that belief has to be uh, eliminated or fought or, countered for any of it to change. It's funny, I was in the car with my husband today, and we were talking about how someone the other day saw me in a wheelchair, and they were like, "I am so sorry, you're in a wheelchair." And we were laughing about how silly it is to be sad when a chair has wheels, because like, all people do is sit on things that roll. Like, we were in a car, which is a thing with chairs that has wheels on the bottom, like, it's like the baggage that comes along with the wheelchair is so much more significant than the actual fact that I sit on a chair that wheels around.
The actual horrible thing is that anyone came up with a chair that doesn't have wheels, so that if you need to move the heavy chair around, you have to actually pick it up and carry it. That's very
Yeah.
ironic in an odd way. There's a lot of good material. Hopefully people are able to check this book out. I'm just curious, if you think about, the next 5 years, what are the first changes you would like to see in Canada related to parenting and disability?
I think
Very
graduate yeah, just
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
the simple I think graduate programs need to be more accessible so that more people in decision-making positions are disabled. I think it is impossible for things to change if disabled people like us aren't there with power. That would be the first step, and then I think that accessible housing is another huge part of this. You know, there is a total dearth of accessible housing in the US and Canada, and that negatively impacts quality of life for all disabled people.
Accessible activities too, I imagine, for
Right.
kids and parents are can be really tough in an inaccessible society.
Mhm.
How have you found dealing with that, especially with young kids?
Oh, it's so hard. There's, like, so many things I don't get to go to, birthday parties or dance classes, or I my kid has gone to a few schools I couldn't enter. I mean, I live in a world where she gets to go many places that I don't, and that doesn't feel fair to her, and it certainly doesn't feel fair to me.
Any advice for new parents or people who would like to become parents who happen to have a disability?
I would say that the thing that has helped you survive every day up until now, that strength and the ingenuity and the community you've built, like, all of that will come into play with your kid in ways that you cannot imagine, and that you have been training for this even without meaning to, despite all the messages to the contrary.
Thank you so much. Your book is
Yes.
called Unfit Parent, A Disabled Mother Challenges an Inaccessible World. There is so much more I'd love to talk about, but we are out of time. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us on The Pulse.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Pulse airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio, repeating every 6 hours. You can also catch The Pulse on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.